Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we were going to finish the Congress of Vienna series. So this is my part 4, but his part 2. So we left off when he was going to talk about the German states, right? So let's get into this. Original videos down below. Let's go.
Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress of Vienna had agreed to use the 1792 borders as a starting point for negotiations. Well, in 1792, the Holy Roman Empire existed.
Exactly.
Metternich had no interest in turning back the clock. The Holy Roman Empire had proved itself to be a totally inept institution when faced with a real threat. The German Committee had the task of figuring out,
which throughout history has always been like that. Like I said on a previous episode report, the Holy Roman Empire had almost always either a civil war between some German states or Hungarian or Italian states, which mainly was of the schism, right? Between, or I don't know if it's a schism. Maybe it was the schism, I don't remember, but it's between states who were more loyal to the crown of either their king, prince, or emperor versus to the church, the pope, bishops, right? So there was always a civil war there. But then there was also the geopolitical wars that the Holy Roman Empire was always in. Against France, against Italy, against Austria, against England. Maybe once or twice, right? But yeah, it makes sense that it's not the strongest institution to protect the smaller German states, right?
What Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. As far as Metternich could see, there were 4 possible paths forward.
Okay.
Option number 1, complete independence for everybody. Option number 2, a German empire united under one government. Option number 3, a loose confederation of German states. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia expand and conquer their smaller neighbors.
Alright, let's go through them. Complete independence. In their minds, it will lead to conquest of those German states by either Prussia, Austria, France, Netherlands, Sweden, you name it, Denmark, or like Bavaria or Saxony will conquer the smaller German states, right? Okay, so that probably is off the table. German Empire, interesting, right? Unite all of them, and instead of a Holy Roman Empire, you have a German Empire, probably more centralized government or whatever, yeah, right? A loose confederation. That could work, because that's better than the empire, right? And then the last, Austrian and Prussian conquest. They've already done that. But Austria wants to be the rule of law, the president, the traditionalists, right? So they don't want to conquest the German states. Prussia would like to do that. They already got some, right? In the West. So out of these 4, I think they will go for the third one. I think that would make it better. Let's see.
All 4 of these options presented problems. If they decided to go with option number 2, a united German empire, Metternich would obviously insist upon a Habsburg emperor. But given recent experience over Saxony, Metternich did not believe that the Prussians would submit to the Austrians like that. In addition to that, Metternich was getting signals from Castlereagh that the British would not sign off on the creation of a German empire. So option number 2 seemed a dead end. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia conquering their neighbors, didn't seem great either. Such aggressive behavior would frighten all the other great powers, and if any of them tried to protect one of the smaller German states, they would all be at war again.
Yep.
That left option number 1 or option number 3. Either complete independence or a loose confederation. Of the two, Metternich's preference was for a loose confederation. He
Makes
thought
sense.
that complete independence would leave Central Europe weak and unable to defend itself. It would only
Sure.
be a matter of time until some outside power went to war with one of Austria's weaker neighbors. And then Austria would intervene, and then we're back in a great power conflict situation. A
Yep.
loose confederation, on the other hand, might be enough to deter meddling from outside powers.
Yep.
If there was to be a German confederation, Metternich would first need to mend the relationship with Hardenberg. The Prussian duplicity over Saxony had left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, but if the two great powers were to live under the same umbrella, they would have to be friends. Metternich
That's
began
true.
making his pitch to some of the smaller German states. He found very little resistance. Many
Okay.
felt burned over the Saxony debacle and sought a closer strategic relationship with Austria for their own protection.
Interesting.
Metternich's vision for a German confederation would look like this. All states within the confederation would maintain their independence, except
Okay.
when it came to matters of military defense. Under the German confederation, an attack on one would be an attack on all. Any outside power sticking their nose into German affairs would be met with the combined strength of every German state.
Which was sort of the point of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Sort of. But then you had all the civil wars and conflicts between the church and the emperor, right? So I don't
This
see it
ruffled
here.
some feathers because it restricted the ability of German states to make alliances with outside powers.
Yep.
Bavaria in particular was upset by this, but Metternich
Sure.
soothed things over by pointing out that this would put them in a military alliance with 38 other German states. Such a thing had not been possible under the Holy Roman Empire, and such
That's
a thing
true.
would not be possible to anybody out there negotiating on their own. Of course, Austria and Prussia were to be exempt from this. They
Yep.
had their own goofy reasoning. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires. Whatever.
Yep.
The real reason is that they were great powers and reserved the right to make alliances or war as they wished.
Yep.
Austria and Prussia would be the two anchors of the German Confederation, and it
Makes
was
sense.
paramount to the survival of the Confederation that the two great powers within it got along. The German Confederation would have a central diet, a legislature, located in the free city of Frankfurt. The diet
Okay.
was conceived as a sort of United Nations of Germany, where various independent German states would come together and resolve any disputes that might lead to war. They would also work to reduce barriers so that Germans could live and work and write in any German-speaking country without fear. To this end, they created a weak federal legal system to protect certain political rights across borders.
This looks like a smaller version or a smaller scale of what the US is at this time and is today, right? The federal legal system or the federal system should only protect the rights. It shouldn't impose anything, right? This makes sense. And I mean, Germany is also today built on states like the US, right? Not exactly the same. But you can see the building blocks here, right?
Hardenberg of Prussia was surprisingly supportive of this proposal. The German Diet treated Austria and Prussia as equal partners,
Yep.
which was reassuring to an insecure and young power such as Prussia.
Okay, Italy. Let's see what Austria does here, right? Because remember, Austria Habsburgs have had control of Spain, Netherlands, a lot of states in Italy, and of course Austria, right? For a long time. So let's see what Austria does here, right? Let's see if they're as hands off as we would think.
there were other areas that could not be fully restored under the 1792 borders. Italy had been totally reshaped under French rule, and the Congress of Vienna needed to decide how much French influence was acceptable in the region going forward. At the moment of his defeat, Napoleon had been king of Italy, really northern Italy, and his son had been king of Rome, also northern Italy, and one of his top generals had been the king of Naples, southern Italy. Obviously, this arrangement couldn't continue, but it was not immediately clear what the Congress should do. Metternich and the Austrian emperor took a particular interest in this. They considered northern Italy Austria's backyard. Metternich believed that if Austria and France were in constant competition for influence in northern Italy, it would eventually end in another war. Whatever the new political settlement in northern Italy looked like, it had to be able to resist French influence going forward.
But I mean, so the argument is that if both France and Austria have 50-50 influence of northern Italy, then that at some point it will turn into a conflict. But then Austria can just say, oh yeah, we just gotta take everything. We influence the entire northern Italy, and France can't get near it. I mean, sure, but then you're overstepping boundaries of independent states, but okay.
Metternich spoke to Castlereagh about this, and the two found that they were of the same mind. Castlereagh told him that Britain was not overly concerned about the future of northern Italy, so long...
Which, again, okay, that makes sense. So long France does not control it, okay. From the British perspective, this makes sense, because what does the British don't care about Italy. Because why would they? They have sort of their allies of Austria there at the border. They don't care about that. They only care about that Russia it has a buffer zone before entering Central Europe. That's why they care about Poland, right? And Saxony, right? In between Prussia and Austria. But they don't care about Italy, because what is Italy in between? France, their enemy, sure, and then Austria. It makes sense why they wouldn't care that much.
Out of reach for the French. The two men came to
It's a double standard though, but
remembering the Poland-Saxony crisis, Castlereagh said that the British public was in an anti-imperialist mood right now, and so he couldn't appear to support any sweeping annexations of territory.
Makes sense still.
Britain had no problem with Austrian hegemony in the region. If Metternich could draw up a plan that only made minor territorial adjustments, wink wink, he could count on Castlereagh's support. Once it became clear...
This is funny though, because if you know about World War I, one of the reasons why, spoilers if you don't know, but one of the reasons why Italy switched sides from the Triple Alliance to the Entente is because Austria don't want to give up land that they gained from here. I believe it's here they gain land that a lot of Italian-speaking people are living in, right? So if Austria-Hungary gave Italy the land that Austria was given here or took here, then Italy might have been neutral in World War I, or maybe been on the Central Power side. So this is the building blocks for World War I. You can see it all. It's pretty cool.
To all parties that the future of Italy was being discussed. There were calls to replicate the success of the German committee by forming an Italian committee.
But that's not what the Austrian wants.
Shut this talk down immediately.
Yeah.
Per their agreement, the future of Italy would be decided by Metternich alone.
Wow. Double standard, but it makes sense why, but
This is what he came up with. Austria would conduct a minor territorial adjustment by directly annexing Lombardy and Venice. This would add millions of Italians to the Austrian Empire. Metternich knew that the Hungarians would have opposed any deal that added more ethnic Germans to the empire, since it would have upset the delicate balance within Austria.
But the Austrians here could appease the Italians because they can make the argument, oh, we are rescuing you Italians from the French, we've defeated them, so you can vote on these legislators and all these bills that we're putting up. So they're basically getting voters or taxes, right, and military men.
Landing into northern Italy was seen as politically neutral, so Metternich used this opportunity to beef up Austria by annexing one of the richest parts of Europe.
Yep.
Castlereagh noticed this, but deemed it minor enough to escape the notice of the British public.
Sure.
Next, Metternich recreated the Duchy of Parma and handed it over to Mary Louise of Austria, the Austrian Emperor's eldest daughter. The fact that she remained the wife of Napoleon was a bit inconvenient, so Metternich carved out a rule so that the duchy would go to some nephew of the Spanish king upon her death.
That makes
Spain had been
sense.
upset when Metternich got the authority to reshape northern Italy, and this was Metternich's way of throwing them a bone.
Okay.
The Grand
Makes
Duchy
sense.
of Tuscany was also recreated and handed over to the brother of the Austrian emperor. Similarly,
Wow.
the Duchy of Modena was recreated and handed to some cousin of the Austrian emperor.
Wow.
Noticing a pattern yet? By doing
Look
this,
at that.
Metternich technically met Castlereagh's requirement to not openly annex all of northern Italy.
Yeah.
But it was a
But I mean, he's doing what Napoleon did in Italy and Germany, for that matter. Putting his brothers and sisters, cousins, husband, whatever, right, in those areas to control those areas. Which is not a new thing, right? That's the whole reason why France looks like that, England looks like that, Spain looks like that. Like that makes sense. Or why Austria looks like that, right? No wars, said the Habsburgs.
bit deceptive.
Only marriage.
In some cases, the prime ministers of these new states would be Austrian officials hand-picked by Metternich.
Wow.
On paper, these were all independent countries, but in reality, the Austrians were treating northern Italy like a colony. In addition to all this, Metternich reformed the Papal States, which was an important sticking point to the majority Catholic Austrian Empire.
Yep.
He also strengthened and restored the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. As an independent and fairly strong regional power, they would serve as a buffer against any future French expansion.
Like they did before.
Finally, Napoleon's former general was eventually removed from southern Italy, and a distant relation of the King of Spain returned to rule the region once more. I should briefly talk about how Napoleon's general was removed from southern Italy. It
Oh yeah,
involves
that's
an
interesting.
event known to history as the 100 Days.
Yep. Here we go.
Here's a brief summary of what happened. When the Congress of Vienna was like 6 months into negotiations, Napoleon secretly slipped away from his confinement on the island of Elba and landed in southern France.
Which, let's talk about Elba. Napoleon became Emperor of Elba. He kept the title of Emperor. And he made Elba very, I don't know, rich, but he made it very industrialist. Yeah, you can say very rich, but he lifted up Elba, right? And that's Napoleon. No military, nothing like that. He had like 1,000 men or something with him. But that's it, right? No military conquest. That's just administration, right? And now, because I guess he was bored or something to go back to France, right? He wanted back France, right?
He marched north with maybe 1,000 supporters, but as he advanced, thousands more flocked to his banner. 3 weeks after landing in France, he captured Paris without firing a shot. The Allies had long feared something like this, and
every time, I think the king sent 2 armies to take Napoleon, and one of them, I think the first one was Ney with them, and Ney and the army joined Napoleon, and I think that's the reason why he was executed later on, Ney, right? For not capturing Napoleon. And then after Napoleon went a little bit north, another army came, and they joined Napoleon, and then the king fled to Belgium, I think.
in fact, During the last 6 months of negotiations, the great powers had kept their armies mobilized for this very reason. Within hours of Napoleon's disappearance from Elba, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were marching on France. 3 months after Napoleon captured Paris, British and Prussian armies faced the French outside the town of Waterloo in the Netherlands, current-day Belgium. At Waterloo, Napoleon was soundly defeated by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon fled, and about a month later, he surrendered to the British, who promptly sent him to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where, under the watchful eye of the British, he would spend the rest of his days.
I think 2 ships sailed around the island all the time. And there was like, I don't know how many soldiers were on the island. Preventing a ship to come and rescue Napoleon or something. I don't know, right?
I've been strategically talking around the 100 Days for this entire video, because while it's certainly militarily interesting, and Napoleonically interesting, it's not diplomatically interesting. From the perspective of the Congress of Vienna, the 100 Days were a brief pause in negotiations, after which everyone just picked back up where they left off.
That's true.
And this may annoy some people, but it must be said, the 100 Days were a particularly close call. When Napoleon captured Paris, he had maybe 50,000 soldiers at his disposal. The Allies had 1 million. Naturally, Napoleon immediately began raising 100,000 additional soldiers. But so did the Allies, and by this point, the Allies were faster. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo, there would have been another Waterloo later that summer. If he had won 10 Waterloos, the Allies still would have had him outnumbered. The entire 100 Days was an act of delusion, and...
Although I would say, I would argue, this is not an argue for Napoleon that he might have won something and then became emperor. He might as well. But my argument is that the same people who say this wouldn't have said in the beginning or in the middle of Napoleon's career, when he was against same odds, sort of, right? Napoleon only came close to 1 million soldiers, active soldiers in, 4 armies or whatever it was, but in one area when he was invading Russia with like 650,000 men. And he didn't use all of them. So, I mean, Napoleon was always against 1 million soldiers because he was against Austria, England, Spain, Portugal, Prussia, some German states, some Italian states, Russia. I mean, he was always against 1 million soldiers. So, yes, I understand, but he could have won, right? He was always against these odds, right? But of course, when you have been in war for that long, then you lost veterans, right? So that's the delusion, right? He could have stayed in power, or he could have made his son stay in power or something like that. But of course the coalition didn't want that in Italy, right? So, oh well.
There was never a serious threat of a French victory. Anyways.
One thing though, but I mean, the coalition said that exact same thing to themselves in Austerlitz. I mean, there's a lot of battles where they said, "Oh, we have him outnumbered. We have this many troops, this amount of money," and then they still lost at Ulm. So
I bring all that up because Napoleon's former general, the King of Naples, sided with Napoleon during the crisis, which gave Metternich a good excuse to remove him from power and have him executed.
And Ney. Slave trade makes sense.
So here was the framework for the final settlement. Broadly speaking, Europe would return to its 1792 borders. Russia would swallow up Poland under a strict constitutional arrangement, and Prussia would annex half of Saxony. The Holy Roman Empire would be replaced with the much more practical German Confederation. Northern Italy would become an anti-French zone under Austrian supervision. With negotiations drawing to a close, there was one lingering issue that had not yet been addressed. The British Prime Minister Liverpool instructed Castlereagh to begin discussing slavery. By 1815, the British slavery political movement had truly become a force to be reckoned with. In 1788, a bunch of local abolitionist groups sent Parliament 60,000 signatures calling for the abolition of slavery. In 1815, these same groups gathered almost 1 million signatures, but this time they didn't send them to Parliament. They sent them to Castlereagh in Vienna. One statistic that was not lost on anybody was that the number of signatures sent to Castlereagh was greater than the total number of votes in the last election. This was not simply an act of protest. It was a shot across the bow. By this time, every British city and most British towns had an abolitionist group that was active in local politics. It was not uncommon for the average British voter to hear about the ongoing sin of slavery on a weekly basis in their church and in their newspaper. The issue became impossible to avoid. After one particularly incendiary pamphlet went viral, more than 300,000 women pledged to boycott sugar since it was exclusively produced with slave labor. People were hungry for action, and when the government showed no interest...
I mean, I would hope we would do the same in the West against, like, Chinese things, right? And against, like, batteries and solar powers, right? Because all of those are child labor, some of slave labor in Africa and some in China, right? So I would hope we would do the same thing, not buy the things that are made from slavery and child labor, right? But I guess it's too inconvenient, but you know.
In doing anything, they grabbed at whatever consumer choices might make a difference. Political activism against slavery was so popular in some circles that it became fashionable, literally. This medallion, called the Wedgwood Medallion, was mass-produced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Men generally wore them around their necks, and women around their wrists or pinned into their hair.
I mean, it makes sense that it spread through churches and people gathering together, because if you're Christian, every human being is made in the image of God. And if someone is using another human being as a slave, that's like you spitting at God, right? So, not to get too religious here, but it makes sense. Why you think that? On an ethical level, right? That's where the ethical comes. Then of course you can take in other viewpoints, economically, whatever, right? It's not the exact same thing, but you can connect it to Chinese labor, because Chinese labors and products are much cheaper, right? But the labor, something devious is going on, right? And of course, some parts in other countries there's that as well, but on the larger scale, right? Everybody's buying from China, right? And it's cheaper products, meaning cheap labor, meaning you just buy it because it's cheap, right? Let's keep going.
The inscription reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image of a man kneeling in chains became the most widely distributed piece of art depicting a black man ever, and the unofficial logo of the anti-slavery movement. In 1807, at the end of a political fight that lasted more than 15 years, Britain passed an act that abolished the British slave trade. It did not abolish the act of slavery, but it made it illegal to transport enslaved persons across the Atlantic to the country.
It makes sense to, first of all, stop the trade itself, then you stop the exchange itself, right? Buying something because of this, right? Which again, you can't overreach here though. A government can't just say, even though ethically and morally and all that, You have to have the groundworks to say the government is removing this because of this. But again, if a government, which this is good, and I agree with this, if a government gets rid of the slave trade in a way that they can get rid of your free speech or freedom of expression or whatever, that's a slippery slope, but that's good. But you have to stop the trade itself, then sort of the transaction, right? You buying and selling, you have to do it gradually because it makes sense.
Colonies. Advocates believed that without new bodies coming over from Africa, chattel slavery in the colonies would mostly die out within 1 or 2 generations.
Yeah, the Americans thought the same. The fathers of the US, right? Founding fathers, which they are correct and were correct, right? And these look the same.
Wrong, but it was nevertheless a big deal that Britain finally acknowledged that their goal was to eventually abolish slavery. The abolitionists were correctly not satisfied by this half measure. They demanded nothing less than the complete and total abolition of slavery. And as the years went on, their influence only continued to grow. Lord Liverpool inherited this political situation when he became Prime Minister, and he wasn't happy about it. He was holding on to his conservative Whig majority in Parliament by the barest of threads. And now the abolitionists had sent 1 million signatures to his foreign secretary in Vienna. Liverpool didn't really care one way or the other about slavery, but if he didn't give these people something, they might topple his government. He instructed Castlereagh to try to get some anti-slavery commitments into the final agreement at Vienna.
Okay. Makes sense. And the ball was rolled.
Castlereagh approached the 8-member Central Committee.
This is going to be interesting because Russia have serfs, right, which are slaves, right? They're not the property, they're on a property that they have to take care of, but they can't leave it or do anything. So they're bound to the property. They're not themselves the property, right? I think that's the difference between slaves and serfs. Both are slaves, but in another way, in another context.
Is the 5 great powers plus Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, and asked them to include a provision in the final agreement that committed everybody to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Of those present, only Britain and Sweden had abolished the slave trade. Castlereagh's opening position was that everybody else should adopt Britain's anti-slavery laws. Another way of saying that is that Castlereagh was not committing Britain to any further anti-slavery reforms. This fact was not lost on Castlereagh's negotiating partners. Spain, Portugal, and France threw a fit. France is an interesting case because they had heroically abolished slavery at the beginning of their revolution. And then under Napoleon, they shamefully brought it back. Spain
a little bit,
Portugal were the other 2 powers most heavily enmeshed with the slave trade. Spain, Portugal, and France.
I mean, Brazil.
That Britain only wanted to abolish the slave trade because they had a head start out in the colonies. They also argued that an agreement like this would give the British Navy an excuse to stop and inspect every ship in the Atlantic. In other words,
this is why a government has to have the groundworks of doing a decision, right, that can be used one way or the other, right? Because this is true. I mean, look at the War of 1812, right? The reason, or one of the reasons why it started, was because British ships stopped and searched American ships because they were probably doing trade with France, which they were allowed to do, no? Right? There were some other things with Canada as well, right? So Portugal's defense here makes sense because Britain comes in here just hand on fist, right? Like, you have to do this. And what is the or else, right? So let's say this scenario, you have to do this or else we will search your ships and do that and whatever, right? And stop your ships trading and all that. But also, if you do this, we can do this to see if you're doing slave trade, right? From their perspective, I understand. Of course, the question, the broad question makes sense. Obviously, the ethical, moral, whatever, that doesn't make sense to us. To them, it makes sense, sort of, right?
Words. This would all be to Britain's advantage.
It's true.
Castlereagh tried to respond by appealing to morality, but this only incensed them even further. One Spanish diplomat got in Castlereagh's face and told him the English have always been good at making business march alongside honor. Joke's on him, Castlereagh was Irish.
I'm Irish.
Sure. At that time, I don't think that mattered.
If we think about this for a moment, Castlereagh could have shown Britain's commitment to the...
I mean, though, it makes sense in the eyes of the... whatever, because it's like the Brits are doing the same thing as them, but then they're sitting on their high horse and then telling everybody what to do, right? Which, again, a great power can do that, and they can do that, right? They just have to be firm and keep it strong, right? A true believer, not just when a Spanish diplomat comes and say, oh, you're on your high horse or whatever. You have to be strong, a true believer. Right?
By talking about complete and total abolition, which would have
Sure.
hurt Britain more than anyone. If
Yeah.
he had walked into the room talking about abolition, he would have had some credibility, because he would have been saying, let's all do something difficult together.
Nah, I don't think so.
But Castlereagh didn't bring up total abolition, because
I don't
he
think
was
that
an
would have-
imperialist.
I disagree there. I don't think Alexander would have agreed with that. He would have done the sly thing. Yeah, I agree with you, and then just have serfs still, right? Or slaves, right? Hardenberg, I don't think he would have. Maybe Hardenberg would. Maybe a little bit. Maybe. Talleyrand, I don't think. Metternich, I don't think. So I disagree with him on this. Yes, he is an imperialist. But that doesn't mean you have to do slavery. Right? And if he would have come strong-handed, even stronger-handed than he came in that meeting, everybody would have been against him. Even Sweden that had abolished slavery with Britain, right? It was slave trade, right? I disagree with him a little bit here.
He wasn't that personally bothered by slavery.
He doesn't
After
have to
some
be. You don't have to be that, right? It's an even greater thing to do when you're advocating for something, even though you don't agree with it one way or the other, right? But you're still saying, oh, maybe we should do this, right? Instead of being a true believer and just saying we have to do this because this. Both are correct, but one way is more of a high road than the other, because the true believer, we already know what you want, right? With Castlereagh, we don't know. He doesn't care one way or the other. Okay, that's fine. But he's still bringing it up, right? That's good.
Organizing negotiations,
I think.
They agreed to attach a document to the final treaty coming out of Vienna called a
Okay.
Declaration of Intent to Abolish the Slave Trade. At Spain
Okay.
and Portugal's insistence, this declaration would be non-binding, which sucks. Castlereagh was like,
Sure.
if it's non-binding, we're going to need to show people some specific goals, at least. France agreed to abolish the slave trade within 5 years. They would
Okay.
blow right past that deadline. Spain
Yeah.
agreed to abolish the slave trade within 8 years, with some pretty large loopholes. They would
Okay.
blow right past that deadline. Portugal would only agree to abolish the slave trade north of the equator. And since they didn't really have any colonies north
Right.
of the equator, this was pretty
Exactly.
much a giant middle finger to the rest of the Congress.
Yeah, because they have Brazil.
Castlereagh also got all of the participants to declare their intention to eradicate slavery once and for all. But they
Which, again, name me another country that has slavery and uses slavery that did this. Even though they're all disagreeing, they're bringing it up and talking about it. And that means the ball is rolling. It means at any point in history it would end. If no one would have started this, slavery would have still been a major economic thing in the world today, which it already is sort of in China and some parts of Africa still, right? Because people in those countries didn't talk about it, didn't bring it up, right? And we in the West are a little bit complacent and being forced by the government to buy cheaper things that are from child labor, right? And slave labor. Because in our own countries it's more expensive to buy, right? Than from China, for example, right? And this push for solar power that is made in China of the raw material which is from Africa, from some child labor and slave labor, right? But at least they talked about it. Even though almost no one there agreed, they at least brought it up and made something about it. 5 years, okay, sure. How long have we had slavery in the history of humankind? I don't know. A couple of thousands of years? And you want it all to end in 5-10 years? Sure, I sound harsh, but it's the reality. If they end everything in 15 years, there you go. Right? You can disagree with me in the comments, but
absolutely no specifics and no deadlines. A meaningless statement meant to simply
it's not meaningless.
Public opinion. In the end, Britain's attempt to inject anti-slavery commitments into the Congress was a failure.
It worked.
The
No,
reason
it worked.
it was a failure is that Castlereagh didn't even really try. He was half-hearted from the start, and his reluctance
I disagree
to
a little
come
bit
in
here.
with any radical proposals was a signal to the other great powers that Britain wasn't really taking this seriously. It's a shame, because this was a moment when something big could have been accomplished. Britain had serious leverage and serious public support, and Castlereagh didn't use any of it. One of the consequences
He did,
of
though.
Castlereagh's lack of enthusiasm in 1815 was that slavery continued in places like Cuba and Brazil until the late 1880s.
Yep.
That's a lot of...
But those are independent countries, so this is what I don't understand. These are independent countries, am I wrong? Cuba became independent, no? When did Cuba become independent? When? Was it after the American-Spanish War? No, because Spain had Cuba, right? But when did Brazil become independent?
lives and a lot of years, and it's a real stain on Castlereagh's record that he didn't really
I don't think
try
it is.
to do anything about it. But from a purely political standpoint, the anti-slavery negotiations worked. Prime Minister Liverpool now had something to show the discontents back home, and for now, that was enough.
Okay.
The Treaty of Vienna was finalized in June of 1815. All of the great powers signed off on it. The only outlier was Spain, who remained upset over Metternich's heavy-handed treatment of northern Italy.
Makes
Spain
sense.
refused to sign the final document, which was unfortunate. But so long as all the great powers were on board, this was deemed acceptable. The final treaty was mostly built upon realist principles and created a balance of power with clearly defined spheres of influence that would hopefully prevent future great power conflicts. After Vienna, it was widely understood and accepted that if anybody invaded one of those tiny German states, it would automatically mean war with Prussia and Austria.
But what if they vote to become part of Prussia and Austria?
If anybody invaded northern Italy, it would automatically mean war with Austria. If anybody invaded the Netherlands, it would automatically mean war with Britain. If anybody invaded Poland, it would automatically mean war with Russia. The belief was that so long as governments understood what was and wasn't off limits, minor disagreements could be solved diplomatically, and great power conflicts on the scale of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars could be entirely avoided.
This is the groundworks for a world war. But how would they know?
It was in the interest
doesn't,
of
yeah.
all great powers to respect these limitations, and if any
Sure.
great power was found to be acting recklessly or belligerently, it was in the interest of everybody else to put them in their place. After
Sure.
25 years of chaos and war, the great powers were having a go at stability.
Let's just say this. Let's finish this and let's say, I'm
international
going to say
system
something.
that emerged from Vienna is sometimes called the concert of Europe, as in all of Europe acting in concert or in unison. The next
Okay.
15 years would put a severe test upon the concert system, and we will see in time whether these frenzied and far-reaching negotiations were worth it.
I mean, I would say they were worth it, right? But one thing I have to say here, right? If you don't have an outside enemy, which the whole Congress of Vienna and the Treaty of Vienna is about an outside enemy attacking you and then someone coming to your aid, like NATO, like the Warsaw Pact, right? Someone from the outside is attacking you and then your friends help you. But what happens if you have a civil war, revolutions, right? And a lot of countries change their governments, right? Then the treaty doesn't work, right? That's what we're going to see in 1848. A lot of revolutions against absolute monarchies, or against monarchies as a whole, right? And you have the Crimean War, right? Alright, this has been fantastic. I disagree with him on a little bit things. You can comment down below what you believe. Let's have a discussion about it. Goodbye.